and welcome to Coffee and Crochet. My name is Cora and today we are going to learn how to do a slip stitch. So if you haven't already watched the video on chains, you definitely need to start there. What I have here is the chain that we did last time, and something I want to just point out because I'm noticing here, this is what we mean by gauge or tension. Here I was holding the yarn a little bit tighter. Here I was holding it significantly looser, and as you can see, these chains are a little smaller and a little more close together. These ones have much more open holes. When you start, especially, you're going to want to shoot more for this looser side of things and a little less for this tighter side of things, because as we go back through, especially doing our slip stitches, which is a bit of a tight stitch, you have to put your crochet hook through each one of those little holes and then pull another piece of yarn back through. And that's really easy when you've got nice big clean gaps like this, and it's a little harder when you have tighter gaps like this. So just shoot for loose as you're starting. Even if it's super loose, that's better for practicing until you get comfortable with the process, and then you can work on making tight things. So our slip stitch is essentially a chain stitch when there's already a chain. We get to the end of our chain here. I don't know how many stitches I have. I just randomly chained until I felt like stopping. Eventually, though, we have to go back the other direction, unless you are just trying to make a rope, in which case feel free to just keep going and do whatever you're going to do with that. But most projects, eventually you will need to go back the other direction or start working, even if you're not going in the other direction, if you're joining and doing something around, you're still going to end up working on the chain that you created. So our slip stitch is going to be the same concept of the chain we just did. We're going to do a yarn over and pull it through. But before we do the yarn over, we are going to poke it back into these little holes that we've already created with our chain. So you never ever crochet in the stitch that you just came out of. Well, I won't say never ever crochet, but you don't want to crochet in that stitch for this purpose. If I try to pull through, what I'm going to end up doing is now having a very, very weird little twist on my hook, because there's nothing between those two loops that I just did. So always start one stitch away from the hook. So not in the loop that's right next to the hook, the loop I just pulled through, but one further down. So as you can see, it's probably easier to see with the white background. I've got a nice little hole here, and that's what I'm going to shoot for. I do technically have a hole on the bottom, but we're always going to work on the top side of our row. So I'm going to take my crochet hook, I'm going to pop it through that hole. Now I've got two loops on my crochet hook. Yarn over, just like with my chain, and pull it through 1, 2. So we end up with 1 on our hook again. We're going to do that again. Here's my nice little hole right here. I'm going to pop that hook through, yarn over, pull it through both of these two other loops so that I end with 1. And that is a slip stitch. Basically, I am slipping my working yard through my stitches. But you don't call it slip stitches because that would just be weird. 1, 2, and through. So you'll see right now with the way I am holding, I've got that nice tension going on in this yarn, and then holding my work here. I'm grabbing it with my other fingers back here just to get it out of the way. You don't have to do that. It's entirely optional. But you'll notice the way I'm holding it, when I poke through that hole, my yarn is already almost over. So I just have to kind of drape it down. So you don't have to do a whole nother yarn over. I mean, you can, but that would again be really challenging to get the yarn through. And so we'll save that for specialty stitches down the road instead. So when you poke through, that yarn's already going to kind of be halfway over. Just drape it on down. Pull it through the loop we poked through, and then the loop that was already on our hook. And that is slip stitch. Poke through, drape over, 1, 2. Poke through, drape over, 1, 2. Now with our slip stitch, especially if you're just going to be doing this back and forth, very important that you keep a little bit of tension, but not too much on your yarn. Slip stitches can get really tight really easily, and that makes them very challenging to work in when you get down to the end of the row, and we will get there in a moment. So we're just going to continue that down the whole row. Poke through, 1, 2, poke through, 1, 2, poke through, 1, 2, poke through, 1, 2, and we're going to go ahead and continue this down all the way to the end of our crochet. Okay, so I've made it down nearly to the end of the row here. I made it to those tighter stitches, and so I just wanted to point out here, it's much harder to see the holes with these last 2 stitches because of how tight I was holding the yarn when I did those 2 chains. So in a case like this, I don't have a hole to look for, so I'm just going to look for this top piece of yarn, and that's what I'm going to push under. I have, on some projects, had to actually use my crochet hook to hook that little piece up in order to get through it, because again, I was holding my yarn way too tight, or I was doing a project that just required a tight stitch. So don't be afraid to use that as a tool, kind of like a little screwdriver to pry up that top piece of yarn to get through. And then we're going to slip stitch 1, 2. And now we're at the end of the row. So we're going to go back the other way. This is called turning because we're going to turn and go back the other direction. In order to do this, most of the time you'll do a chain at the end. How many chains you do will depend on how large of a stitch, how tall of a stitch you're doing, which we'll get to in some future videos. But you're just going to, like we did with our first beginning chain, I'm just going to do a loop over there, yarn over, and pull through. And this will give me the ability to turn without making some weird twisty stitches. Now technically with the yarn or with the slip stitch, because it is a short stitch, I wouldn't necessarily need to do a chain because it is a teeny stitch, so I wouldn't end up with any weirdness as far as my edges go. But again, I highly recommend it just because it makes it easier to get to the other side. So going back the other way, you're going to notice our work looks very, very different on this side than it does on this side. We have this nice little chain here, really easy to see the little holes. And if we were just going back in those holes, it would be super simple. But in order to keep going this direction, because I'm right-handed, I had to flip the work over, and it's a little bit less to script here. So in this case, I'm gonna turn it kind of on its edge, and we're gonna talk about front loops and back loops. So you can see I have that lovely chain pattern actually right on the top of my work right now, and I did some really loose stitches here so you can actually see those holes. But these are the holes that are facing away from my body, so these are called back loops. And that's actually what I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch in right now. But just to note, you can slip stitch in the front loops too. A little bit harder to do, a little more awkward for the hand position, but it can be done. So if you notice a crochet pattern though that says back loop or back stitch only, back loop only, that's what it's talking about, is it wants you just to crochet on those pieces, not on the front ones here. Now I could go through both of them as well. So your typical crochet stitch is actually going to go through both your front and your back loop, and that's going to be really challenging to do with a slip stitch as tightly as I did it down here. But I'm actually going to poke my hole. You can't even really see a hole. Let's go a little bit further down here. So here's my front stitch, here's my back stitch, and I'm going to just forcibly poke through both of them to do a slip stitch there. So we're just going to ignore that little loop-de-doo right now. So here, slip stitch through 2. I technically have 3 loops on my crochet hook. 1, 2, 3. Yarn over and pull through. I'm going to do a couple of these just so I can show you the difference in how they look when they're done. And whether you're doing front loop or back loop or both loops will depend again on the project and what texture you're trying to go for. Let me do one more. And I'm going to switch to back loops only. So now I'm just going to find just that back loop to go through. So now, just like the first row, I've got 1, 2, yarn over, pull it through both, through just that back loop, yarn over, pull it through both. I'm going to finish this row off doing just the back loops, and then I'm going to show you what the two things look like and why I normally, if I'm just doing slip stitch, choose to do the back loop only. 2 more, well, I guess technically 3 more. Now 2 more. And last one. So this last stitch gets a little tricky because it gets a little harder to see with the turn. You always want to make sure that you find where that back loop is and do a stitch in there. Otherwise, if I stopped here and went back the other way, I'd end up with this funky little nubby sticking out, which depending again on the project you're doing, might be what you're looking for, but if you want a nice straight edge, you want to make sure you don't forget that last loop. So you can see here's the slip stitches I did going through both. See how compact and how dense that stitch is there? It's really fat this direction, versus when I just did in the back loop, I have something that's a little bit taller now and a little bit thinner, and is actually, you know, you can feel the difference between the two stitches. So that was doing both front and back loop. This is just doing the back loop. You do get a little bit of a different look in it as well. Again, please ignore that little spot there. But I like the back loop because it does give you a flatter piece of work depending on what you're doing. This is a really great stitch if you're doing washcloths, dishcloths, anything like that, because it's a thick, dense one for you, but it's also gives you really cool texture there, whereas this would take you just forever because it's such a short stitch. I mean, you'd have to do a lot of rows to get a full cloth there. So let's do a quick chain, and we're going to turn and go back the other way, going for back loops only, so not the one that we just came through. Here's our next back loop here, and we're going to go ahead and slip stitch our way all the way down. And like I said, you could just keep doing this for 45, 50 rows and make yourself a nice little square, and you have an instant washcloth, especially if you're using a cotton or acrylic yarn. Really, really great for doing dishes. The acrylic yarns, especially these ones, tend to be a little scratchier, so they're really great for scrubbing. But the cotton ones are really excellent too. Very, very sturdy. And then both of them are easy to wash. So there is your slip stitch. Tune in next time as we go over the single crochet.